When I was working on this book, I was actually preparing a class for students on worship. They were preparing for ministry. And there are lots of people in our contexts who don't have any idea what a biblical theology of Scripture might look like. They get their information on what worship they think should look like from the culture around us, or from church history, or from watching other people worship, or sometimes it's even from the professional agencies, recording companies, which try to create a certain disposition, attitude toward worship. When I was doing this book, my concern was to go back to Scripture. As evangelical Christians, the root of our theology and the root of our practice in church, the heart, the foundation, is always the Scriptures. So I thought worship should go there too. And I started to look at the way worship is presented in Scripture. And I learned very quickly that true worship is not determined by the worshipers. The person, the only one who can determine what true and acceptable worship is God, the Lord, the one we worship. Well, if that is the case, then we have to ask the question, how do we know what God thinks about worship? Well, again, the answer to that one is primarily from the Scriptures. We can talk to each other about how worship should be, but in the final analysis, we must go back to the Bible. The Scriptures are our authority on what pleases God when we worship. So, as I started this project, I had all sorts of topics related to worship. And for every topic, I began by asking, what does the First Testament, usually called the Old Testament, think about worship? What is its theology of worship and the practice of worship arising out of that theology? And then in every chapter, I go to the New Testament. What does the New Testament do with it? Does it put an end to what was happening in the First Testament? Or does it continue? Or does it simply transform it? So my concern in this book is to help church leaders, and not just church leaders, Christians, understand what worship is, who is this person we worship, and what does he think about how we worship, and thirdly, what kind of person's worship is acceptable to God. Everybody worships, but not everybody worships acceptably. We have people who worship other gods. They're worshiping. But from the biblical point of view, it's false worship. But we also have people who claim to be worshiping the one true and only God. And while they worship the true God, the way they practice worship is actually wrong. And that makes it false worship.